Our next speaker is Terry Valen. Originally from New Orleans, Terry is now in San Francisco, where he is the executive director of the Filipino Community Center, and he also heads the National Alliance of Filipino Concerns. In these capacities, he has successfully battled wage theft, where A, employees pay less than minimum wage, or B, refuse overtime pay, or C, force workers to work, quote unquote, off the clock. Terry is committed to continuing this fight. Terry Valen.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. It's hard to follow Bernadette every time, but I'm honored to be working with her at the Filipino Community Center and to be here with all of you. Mr. Alex Dillor, the FONS Delano chapter, my colleagues, and Don Mabalo and Robin Rodriguez, I've been working with for now decades, I think, and all of you, the colleagues, my comrades, my kasamas in this room. I have the privilege of working at the Filipino Community Center to be part of the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns that is trying to build and address the need for collective action at all levels in this country and around the world so that our communities continue this legacy. So I'm just going to talk a little bit and hopefully address kind of some of the points that really inspired me to do the work that I do, continue to inspire me to struggle as hard as we need to struggle from the Delano Grape Strike in particular. Some of the work we've done through NAFCON and the FCC, touch on that a little bit. The context that we're in that Greg mentioned a little bit, we're in a different situation today, but there is a legacy that we need to uphold and talk a little bit about the challenges ahead for all of us. It's an honor to be here because you all are part of preserving, promoting, but also upholding, and what we have to do then is advance kind of the legacy of Philip Cruz, Larry Leon, all of the leaders and all of the rank and file members of the United Farm Workers, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. We really have to carry that forward, otherwise we're not really honoring the legacy of those farm workers today. For me, what's really inspiring is their perseverance, their militancy, their internationalism, and that scientific, that methodical approach that folks have talked about that Larry Itliong and so many others had. They persevered through so much. Don historically talked about it was decades of work. It wasn't, a few weeks of work or whatever, but decades of struggle, where you had huge numbers of organizing of workers from Hawaii to California and other parts of the country. They persevered through so much. The struggles and sacrifices that they made, the repression that they faced. It was killings, beatings, lynchings, massacres, discrimination, all of those things that were hardcore repression that, to us, I'll talk about it later, there's no excuse for the sacrifices that we should be ready and willing to face today. Their militancy and willingness to stand up, in the most militant ways against the repression they were facing, against the unfair working conditions they face. Not that they were asking for concessions and asking for a few reforms, but standing up militantly and saying that we demand these things and we will not stop until we get them. And then the internationalism, that a lot of it talked about in terms of multiracial alliances within the farm worker movement. There were Filipinos, Mexicans, there were Arabs, Yemeni farm workers, there were black farm workers, and all of them working together. But also the thing that inspired me in particular from Philip Veracruz was his internationalism in talking also about what's happening in the Philippines and other places around the world. Don talked about this absolute discipline, absolute unity, absolute militancy of the farm workers from Larry Itliong and all of the workers there. How do we get to that? How do we have that scientific, methodical, organizing approach that we need today more than ever so that we can have thousands, 1,500 workers decided to strike and step forward together? I don't think we have those numbers today. We need to build to those numbers, but where we have thousands, in the 20s in Hawaii it was 30,000. In Stockton, in the asparagus fields, it was 5,000 to 7,000. We just don't have those numbers today. And how do we get back to those numbers of the kind of power that we need in our communities and organizations to address what's happening today? What we're facing today, and the conditions have changed and shifted a little bit. So since that time, since the 60s, globalization. When we talk about internationalism today, you cannot now talk about internationalism, just about multiracial alliances within this country, but the fact that if you were organizing farm workers and against agricultural growers and corporations, you now have to talk about transnational corporations and how these things are going to the Philippines and other third world countries and not allowing people to have food sovereignty, to grow their own food. So a farm worker struggle today would have to be an internationalist struggle. And so globalization today is something that we're facing. I'm just going to talk about this last decade or so. that makes it even harder, right, to build organizations and the power we need, but there's no option, there's no substitute for what we need to do. The work we've done through NAFCON really was born out of right after September 11th. That is another fact, another condition that we're facing. After September 11th, after the declaration of a war on terror, NAFCON emerged in 2003 to help, in particular, Filipino airport screeners. If we don't now have industries where there are thousands of workers that we can organize together, we have to go to where they are. There's no choice, right? And so NAFCON put out in 2009 this book, Ating Kalagayan, with a sociologist from San Jose State, which talks about our condition, our situation, socioeconomic profile of Filipinos in the U.S. Where are Filipinos today? What industries do they work in? What communities do they live in? And we need to go to all of those places. We waged a campaign in 2002 where 1,000 Filipino airport screeners were laid off at SFO, San Jose Airport, and Oakland Airport because you had to be a U.S. citizen after September 11th to be an airport screener. National origin discrimination. Class action lawsuit was filed. Years later, it was won, but we were trying to organize the workers there in those airports. We have to go to those places. Also, after September 11th, the attack on the immigrant communities, the anti-immigrant legislation that was coming out, now reshaping immigration. Lillian mentioned after 65, the Immigration Act, but after September 11th, immigration is now a Homeland Security problem. It's housed within the Department of Homeland Security. So NAFCON to get on the immigrant rights struggle and work with groups around the country, different communities, and that's the kind of solidarity and internationalism we need because the immigrant rights struggle today is now a part of or in the context of a war on terror. The financial crisis of 2008. People talk about the Occupy movement and how now fundamentally people are asking more fundamental questions about the economy. The bailout of banks versus the fact that people's mortgages, people's homes, people's lives were being lost, and that the financial crisis allowed people now to talk about capitalism fundamentally and the problems with this new financial arrangement of imperialism and how globalization and the financialization of the economy in the world today and the recessions and the crises that is creating are much deeper and go much deeper to the fundamental problems of what's happening in our economic and political system. So in 2008, the financial crisis is another condition we're facing, and the level of organizing we need to address that is even bigger. In the last few years, these are just some of the conditions we're facing. In the last few years, Joanna mentioned the killing of Trayvon Martin, of Eric Garner, of Michael Brown, of Black lives every 28 hours in this country. These are, racial police violence against our communities, which is not only racist, but as others have mentioned, as Don mentioned, during the Grape Strike and other militant struggles against corporations, it's a tool of repression. The state violence is not only racist, but also a tool of repression. So when we rise up and resist against these things, we see red baiting, we see attacks on our communities. We see it here, we see it in the Philippines, when the schools are teaching indigenous students how to defend their lives and their land against mining and deforestation. Paramilitary groups in the Philippines, the Philippine military, and even U.S. military operations in Mindanao are devastating and massacring our communities. Indigenous leaders just recently in Mindanao were attacked, administrators of schools, staff of schools, community leaders, to the attacks on indigenous leaders in schools also in the Cordillera region. So these are some of the different things that we're facing. NAFCON has done a lot of work in these, a lot of different issues. And so we've taken on wage theft, we've taken on discrimination of nurses, we've taken on immigrant rights, the trafficking of Filipinos in so many different industries. We talk about, where are Filipinos today being exploited? And we have hundreds of teachers in Louisiana, hundreds of teachers trafficked in Baltimore, Maryland, Sentosa 27 nurses, Florida 15 hotel workers, bakery workers in Southern California, food supplier workers in California, care home caregivers throughout the country, but also across California, being trafficked, meaning they were told the same thing that the farm workers are told. There's these false advertisements of incredible wealth in the United States, come to the United States. So the recruiters, traffickers that Bernadette mentioned, with the complicity of the Philippine government, and even companies and corporations in the United States, to the point where they're robbed of tens of thousands of dollars, come here and face no jobs. We've been helping them to get T visas, to adjust their status, and to fight for their rights and their wages that they've won. So these trafficking victims, one of the huge problems that we're taking on as NAFCON And so in all of this context, there is, a few no's that I want to kind of conclude on. For me, the farm worker struggle, there's no better example for us today. But when Filipinos get together, are organized, are militant, internationalists, persevere, and have that absolute unity that we can win. There's no better example for us today than that. As Rob Boncha mentioned, what they stood up against, the repression and the sacrifices they made within their families and communities, there's really no excuses for us to not stand up today, to take on these struggles and work together. And lastly, that there's no substitute for organizing today. While we have virtual organizing, and that's a great way to get people out to events, we need the sustainable organizations that are going to build the power we need over the long term to make the demands that we need to take on this system that is now internationalized and is attacking our communities at every front. So there's no substitute for the organizing work that so many of the earlier panelists talked about. I just have a few last quotes that I want to share from different communities that I've worked with over the years. And it really gets to the essence or the kind of larger demands that we need to be making today. So a Japanese American community activist I met in Los Angeles when I was down there at UCLA said, "We have enough wealth in this country to feed, clothe, house, shelter, provide healthcare education, and educate every single person in this country. And why do we not do that?" These fundamental questions. An African American colleague at Duke, when I was in North Carolina, said, "In America, anyone can make it, right? Anyone." Some of the folks in this room have made it. Anyone can make it. But we're looking for a society where everyone can make it. There is no more period. There's no more 1%. Everyone has access to public education up to high school, but when you get to college, there's only so many who can get into those higher educational systems. And lastly, a Turkish brother that we work with who's working at a Latino organization called there in San Francisco said, we are all trying to get by. A lot of us are trying to get ahead. But what we need to do is get together. And that's, the legacy of the farm worker struggle is if we don't get together, if we don't go to the communities, and our communities meaning going back to the Philippines as well, we're not going to be able to win what we need. We need to take bigger and bolder steps. So the inspiration of this bold step that they took 50 years ago challenges to take bigger and bolder steps together. The last quote from Philip Veracruz, the first campaign I worked on with the Air Force Screeners was called the Philip Veracruz Justice Project down in San Jose because we want to hold up that particular legacy. He said, the struggles that he made and the sacrifice he made for his family, in particular, is for us to use for every person to use his or her intellect for the good of their people, not just for their families, especially the youth who need to become more involved in the social issues of social justice today. That's a challenge for all of us. My ability to have the opportunity to be part of a higher educational system means nothing if we don't take on those struggles and the struggles of social justice, build the organizations we need, find the power to win, and take bigger and bolder steps together.